All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking one of the absolute craziest turnarounds in all of military history. We are looking at how the Roman Republic, teetering on the absolute brink of annihilation, managed to defeat the unbeatable Carthaginian general Hannibal. And spoiler alert, they didn't do it by just being more Roman. Actually, scratch that. They did it by having a brilliant young general essentially steal Hannibal's entire playbook and use it right back against him. To really get this, we've got to set the stage. Picture Italy, right after the horrific Battle of Cannae. Hannibal had just wiped out the largest army Rome had ever fielded. We're talking about a loss of roughly 20% of Rome's military-aged men in a single afternoon. The Romans were literally enlisting teenagers and slaves just to man the city walls because they expected Hannibal to show up at their gates any second. So you're looking at this impossible question. How do you defeat an unbeatable military genius who has just decimated a fifth of your fighting population? That brings us to Section 1, Hannibal's Italian Trap. The answer really starts with understanding this wild paradox about Hannibal's success. See, Hannibal was an absolute master of the battlefield, but his army was built to survive behind enemy lines and just sow chaos. It was definitely not equipped for a direct, massive siege on Rome, which, at the time, was one of the most fortified cities on the planet. He just assumed that after inflicting such massive casualties, Rome would throw in the towel. But Rome had this unprecedented, frankly terrifying attitude toward surrender. They flat out refused. As long as a single Roman was left standing, the war was on.
So how does Rome adapt? They roll out what became known as the Fabian strategy. The Romans finally learned their lesson. They realized, okay, we cannot beat this guy in a fair fight, so they just stopped trying. Instead, they focused entirely on containment. They avoided Hannibal's main army completely and started attacking the smaller southern Italian cities that had defected to him. It turned the war into this massive, deadly game of whack-a-mole. Every time Hannibal rushed over to save an ally, the Romans would just retreat, only to pop right back up the second he marched away.
And this completely killed Hannibal's momentum. He was stuck just endlessly running laps around southern Italy, trying to protect his allies. There's this famous quote from one of Hannibal's own commanders that hits the nail on the head. Hannibal, you know how to win a battle, but you do not know how to win a war. It's brilliant, really. The Romans had taken his grand Italian prize and turned it into his own personal prison. He was totally muzzled. Let's move to Section 2, a different kind of Roman. Because while Hannibal is spinning his wheels in Italy, this entirely new kind of leader emerges for Rome. Enter Scipio. This guy was only 26 years old, a survivor of that massive bloodbath at Cannae, and from a very prestigious Roman family. When his father and uncle were killed fighting the Carthaginians over in Spain, Scipio basically raised his hand and volunteered to replace them. But he wasn't your typical Roman general. He didn't buy into that old-school Roman tactic of just marching in a straight line at the enemy. He was bold, highly charismatic, and an incredible outside-the-box thinker. Scipio zooms out, looks at the broader map, and sees the real strategy. He realizes Spain isn't just some sideshow, it's Hannibal's engine. It's the primary base of support where Carthage is pulling massive resources, manpower, supplies, the whole shebang. So Scipio's grand strategy was simple, but totally revolutionary for Rome. Don't attack the monster directly, attack his base of support. And that meant going straight for Carthage's capital in Spain, the heavily fortified New Carthage. Now, capturing New Carthage seemed practically impossible. It was protected on three sides by a massive lagoon. But Scipio does his homework.
He figures out that every single afternoon the tides shift and make the lagoon briefly shallow enough to wade through. So what does he do? He launches this huge diversionary attack on the main gates to pull all the defenders away. Meanwhile, he sends a tiny infiltration squad to just wade through the low-tide lagoon and scale the completely unguarded northern walls. They open the gates from the inside and boom, Scipio takes the most important city in Spain in a single day.
Section 3. Stealing the Master's Playbook. With New Carthage locked down, Scipio systematically starts dismantling Carthaginian control in Spain. And this brings us to the Battle of Ilipa, where Scipio's tactics reach this crazy peak of deception. It becomes super obvious here that Scipio isn't just fighting Hannibal's armies, he is actively stealing Hannibal's playbook.
So at Ilipa, Scipio is massively outnumbered. For days, both armies line up on the field, but nobody attacks. Scipio intentionally forms a habit. He always puts his strongest Roman legions in the center and his weaker allies on the flanks. The Carthaginians get completely used to this and plan their defense around it. But on the morning of the actual battle, Scipio flips the script. He wakes the enemy up with a surprise dawn attack, meaning they have to rush out without even eating breakfast. Then, at the absolute last second, he reverses his battle lines. He puts his strongest troops on the wings instead of the center. Those wings completely crush the Carthaginian flanks while he holds his center back so the strongest enemy troops can't even get into the fight. It was a total masterpiece of trickery.
When we compare Hannibal's tactics in Italy directly with Scipio's campaign in Spain, it is literally a tactical mirror image. Think about it. Hannibal used the local environment to his advantage in Italy. Scipio used the lagoon at New Carthage. Hannibal staged these brilliant ambushes. Scipio completely enveloped the enemy flanks at Ilipa. Hannibal spent years wooing Italian tribes to defect. Scipio treated the Iberian tribes in Spain incredibly well, flipping them to Rome's side. Scipio even forced the enemy to fight on an empty stomach, which is a classic Hannibal move. Scipio had essentially become the very monster he was trying to defeat.
Having totally conquered Spain, Scipio heads back to Rome a hero and wins the consulship in a landslide. But he knows the job isn't done. That brings us to Section 4, Attacking the Base, Africa. Once again, Scipio argues against going after Hannibal in Italy. Instead, he pitches this wildly controversial idea: let's invade Africa. Let's attack the ultimate base of support, Carthage itself, and force Hannibal to come to us.
But to pull off a massive invasion of Africa, Scipio knew he needed an edge, specifically in cavalry. For the whole war, Carthage's Numidian cavalry had been their absolute trump card. So Scipio dives into some intense diplomacy in Africa. A rival king named Syphax had already sided with Carthage, so Scipio brilliantly allies himself with the other Numidian king, Massinissa. By promising to help Massinissa take the throne of Numidia, Scipio secures that legendary Numidian cavalry for the Romans. Game changer. With his foothold in Africa secure, Scipio shows he can be just as ruthlessly deceptive as Hannibal ever was. He's facing this massive combined Carthaginian and Numidian army, so he fakes peace negotiations. He uses those talks as cover to send envoys into the enemy camp. These guys realize the soldiers' huts are made of highly flammable reeds. So under the cover of darkness, Scipio's men set the entire camp ablaze. As this terrifying inferno sweeps through the camp, the enemy soldiers run out of their beds in a total panic, completely unarmed, right into the swords of the waiting Romans. It was a devastating blow. Scipio is basically unleashing the exact same chaos in Africa that Hannibal had terrorized Italy with for a decade.
So Carthage is in a total state of panic. Their homeland is literally burning, and there's only one guy who can save them. They send an urgent message to Italy. Just imagine the absolute gut punch this was for Hannibal. He spent 16 years bleeding in Italy. He's basically a local at this point. And they tell him, Hannibal, you have to come home. Your Italian campaign has been for nothing. He had to just pack up and abandon his life's work to go defend a homeland he probably barely even recognized anymore.
And that sets the stage perfectly for Section 5, The final showdown at Zama, the climax of the whole war. The master, Hannibal, finally facing off against his mirror image, the student, Scipio. The two greatest military minds of their era, squaring up on one decisive battlefield.
But right before the swords clash, we get this incredibly dramatic, almost movie-like moment. The two legends actually ride out and meet face to face in the middle of the battlefield. Hannibal, who probably saw the writing on the wall, suggests negotiating a peace to avoid risking everything. But Scipio, a guy who was normally known for being merciful, is furious that Carthage recently broke a truce. He just ice-cold rejects him, basically saying, "What could you possibly offer me? I already have it all." The negotiations are dead, the battle is on.
As things kick off, Hannibal unleashes his ultimate terror weapon, 80 massive war elephants right at the Roman lines. He expects them to just smash the Roman infantry to pieces. But Scipio is ready. He had trained his men to intentionally leave vertical gaps in their formations. When those terrifying beasts charged, the Roman light troops just neatly stepped out of the way. If you're a frightened elephant and you have to choose between running into a wall of sharp spears or running down a wide-open lane, you take the lane. The elephants happily treated those gaps like an open highway, running straight through to the back and completely bypassing the heavy infantry.
With the elephants completely neutralized, the battle essentially turns into a brutal foot race. Hannibal had this massive three-line deep infantry formation, and his plan was to use waves of soldiers to just exhaust the Romans into the dirt. Scipio, on the other hand, was betting everything on his newly acquired Numidian cavalry, which was currently busy chasing the Carthaginian horsemen off the battlefield. So the whole war came down to this one question: could Hannibal's fresh third line of seasoned veterans crush the exhausted Romans before Scipio's cavalry could make it back to the fight?
Well, the cavalry won the race. They came charging back just in the nick of time, smashing violently into the rear of Hannibal's veteran infantry. The Carthaginians were completely surrounded and basically hacked to pieces. Just think about this staggering number for a second: 40,000. When the dust finally settled, Rome had lost a few thousand men, compared to 40,000 Carthaginian dead. Scipio had decisively, definitively defeated the great Hannibal.
Scipio goes back to Rome an absolute legend, earning the title Scipio Africanus. But for Hannibal, the story ends in a really tragic way. Years later, he's living in exile, constantly hunted by the Romans. The aging general finally finds himself surrounded with no way out. Rather than give them the satisfaction of capturing him, he takes poison. According to Livy, his last words were this final, bitter jab: "Let us now relieve the Romans of the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death."
It is such a fascinating, kind of somber end to this monumental rivalry. Scipio managed to save Rome by studying his enemies so obsessively that he essentially became him. He adopted the trickery, the environmental tactics, the sheer ruthlessness, and the grand strategic vision of Hannibal himself. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative question to think about. By abandoning their traditional, straightforward ways and becoming the monster in order to defeat the monster, did Rome just write the blueprint for their own